Hello, welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Young-Goo Kim. It has been 10 years since North Korean leader Kim Jong-un came to power. During those 10 years, North Korea has never stopped advancing its nuclear and missile programs. With Pyongyang not responding to the call to resume talks with Washington, the Biden administration has announced its first sanctions designations on North Korea. Today we'll discuss these and more. Joining me is Robert Einhorn, Senior Fellow at Brookings Institution. Ambassador Einhorn served as the U.S. State Department Special Advisor for Non-Proliferation and Arms Control during the Obama administration. Scott Snyder is also with me today. Mr. Snyder is Director of U.S.-Korea Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. His book, South Korea at the Crossroads, examines the trajectory of South Korean foreign policy. Welcome to the program. Really good to have you both today.
Thank you.
It's been 10 years since North Korean leader Kim Jong-un assumed control of North Korea following his father's death. Ambassador, what was most distinctive about his 10-year leadership?
I think a very important and distinctive feature has been Kim Jong-un as a highly visible public figure. His father, Kim Jong-il, wasn't such a public figure. You rarely saw him. It's interesting how many times we've seen the son. Often, every once in a while, he disappears for a few weeks, and that's a big mystery, and people speculate. But in general, he's been the public face of this regime. Everyone knows what Kim Jong-un looks like. And I think another distinguishing feature has been his surprising maturity. People didn't know what to expect when this young man assumed the reins of power. But he has showed tremendous boldness, self-confidence, ruthlessness in consolidating his power. And I think that surprised many people that he would be so decisive. And of course, key distinguishing feature, and I think people will look back at these 10 years as a time when Kim Jong-un was determined to expand and diversify North Korea's nuclear and missile capabilities.
Mm-hmm. Ambassador just mentioned the Kim Jong-un's distinctive feature was visibility and maturity. Mr. Snyder, how would you describe Kim Jong-un's leadership during the past 10 years?
What's increasingly impressive to me is that although Kim Jong-un initially started off patterning his rule after his grandfather, the arc of his rule increasingly reminds me of that of his father in the sense that Kim Jong-il, after he got out of famine, pursued an economic reform program that was followed by retrenchment and re-centralization. And I think that we see the same thing under Kim Jong-un, with the difference that following an effort to reform, under Kim Jong-un, we see retrenchment that seems like it might actually bring the country back into famine.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. Snyder, just like his father and his grandfather, Kim Jong-un seemed to believe the nuclear capability is an integral part of his power. Do you think it was really so?
I think that the nuclear program became an instrument for legitimation under Kim Jong-un that highlights the legacy of his grandfather and his father. And it forestalls the risk. He may perceive it as forestalling the risk of destabilization, but it's also come at a cost because it's that very program that I think has prevented him from being able to achieve his economic objectives.
Mm-hmm. Ambassador, you earlier mentioned that Kim Jong-un was diversifying the country's nuclear and missile programs. Do you think this kind of a pursuit of the weapons, do you think that this make his power more solid?
Well, I think he certainly believes that this nuclear deterrent and missile program is integral to the survival of his regime. He seems to regard the capability as indispensable, not something to be bargained away. both because of its utility, in his view, of deterring aggression against North Korea and its utility in intimidating South Korea. But also, I think he believes it helps him maintain domestic support for his regime, especially among the military, which is such an important power broker in North Korea.
Mm-hmm. And Ambassador, we all remember the 3 meetings between Kim Jong-un and former U.S. President Donald Trump. Did the nuclear and weapons programs actually help enhancing the North Korean regime's diplomatic stand abroad?
No, look, these nuclear and missile programs have helped isolate the regime politically. They've resulted in great economic sanctions and so forth. But Kim Jong-un knows that without these nuclear programs, no one would pay attention to his country. His nuclear and missile programs, I think, have made his country and him personally major players on the world stage. So I think for him it's a mixed bag in terms of the international effects of this program.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Snyder, do you think these nuclear and missile programs are serving as effective leverage in North Korea's diplomacy?
I think that in the end, they've been an obstacle to North Korea's diplomatic objectives. And a lot of that revolves around the fact that even though the nuclear programs may have been perceived as useful, especially by Kim Jong-un in the run-up to gaining a summit with President Trump, because he could come out and engage from a position of strength. If we look at the circumstances that he faces today, we see him as isolated as ever. And the objective that the North Koreans indicated in their 8th Workers' Party Congress back in January of gaining prestige benefits, it simply has not been realized in any sustained fashion.
Mm-hmm. And since the Biden administration came into the office, the U.S. has been urging North Korea to engage, saying it is open to talks without conditions. Mr. Snyder, why has not North Korea responded so far?
Well, I think the major reason why North Korea has not responded is because the Biden administration has defined the objective of the negotiations as to achieve denuclearization. And I think that North Korea's objective is to gain the prestige benefits of recognition as a nuclear state. And there simply has not been an identification of an intersection between those 2 objectives.
Mm-hmm.
Can I just, this is one area where maybe I have a slight disagreement with Scott. Yes, it's true that the Biden administration has declared that its ultimate objective is complete denuclearization. But I think it's articulated a very realistic approach that would begin with modest near-term steps toward this goal, an incremental process. And so I think that is not inconsistent with objectives that the North Koreans might even share, and certainly North Korea's neighbors may share that objective. I think the near-term reason Kim Jong-un has not engaged is because of the near total pandemic lockdown. But beyond that, he may be waiting for the South Korean election in March to see the results. He may well be waiting to make further advances in his nuclear and missile programs, so that if in negotiations he's forced to cap those programs, they will be capped at a high level. Sooner or later, the North Koreans may agree to engage, but I think they'll only engage to consider limitations, not the elimination of the program, and then only probably temporarily, and in exchange for very significant political, economic, and security benefits. Whether he will achieve his objectives, I am doubtful, and it may take quite a while for him to come to the negotiating table.
Mm-hmm. Ambassador, just a follow-up on your answer. I was wondering, will U.S. officials be willing to talk with North Korea when North Korea is not willing to really give up their weapons? Will they start talks anyways?
Absolutely. I mean, the Biden administration has made clear, there are no conditions to talks, prepared to sit down anywhere, anytime, and emphasizing that they will sit down without any hostile intent towards the North Koreans, whether the North Koreans believe that or not. I think the Biden team could be a little more explicit about the near-term modest limitations it's prepared to accept. I think China would be quite supportive of this very pragmatic approach to negotiations.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. Snyder, do you have anything to add?
Well, I would just say that Ambassador Einhorn is a diplomat and I'm an analyst, and I just believe that we are at a stage where both countries are trying to shape the environment of the other country in order to achieve the outcome that they desire from the negotiation process. And as long as both sides are focused more on influencing the external circumstances of the other in order to achieve the objective of the process, rather than actually sitting down and talking, we're probably still going to see continued stalemate.
Mm-hmm. And recently, the U.S. has imposed human rights-related sanctions on individuals and entities tied to North Korea. The move is the first sanctions designation on North Korea under the Biden administration. Some watchers say this reflects some of U.S. frustrations toward North Korea, as Pyongyang is not showing its willingness to talk, despite Washington trying to reach out. Ambassador, could this view be right?
Look, the Biden administration is very frustrated with the North Korean unwillingness to sit down and talk. But I don't think that's the reason why these sanctions were imposed. The Biden administration has been very clear that it's committed to pursuing the North Korean human rights issue, even as it seeks to engage the North Koreans in talks about the nuclear question. And recent sanctions, I think, are a reflection of this willingness both to sit down and talk about nuclear issues, but also to address North Korea's abuses of human rights.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Snyder, do you agree with this view that this designation of sanctions was showing the commitment of the Biden administration on human rights issues?
Well, I think it does show commitment of the Biden administration on human rights issues. Frankly, I was a little bit surprised that the sanctions were announced and on those grounds. But I think it is consistent with the Biden administration's approach. My main concern is that the North Koreans, I think, may be likely to use those designations as a further pretext for not engaging in diplomacy.
Can I just ask you why you were surprised?
Well, because so far we have not seen any sanctions designations under the Biden administration. This is really the first one. So my impression was that the sanctions focus actually had to some degree been lost in the set of other priorities that the Biden administration has had to deal with.
Mm-hmm. Ambassador, will this latest move make North Korea more withdrawn?
Well, it's hard to imagine the North Koreans being more withdrawn than they currently are, with their pandemic lockdown and their refusal to sit down and talk. No, I don't think it will have much effect on that.
All right. Mr. Snyder, do you agree with that view?
Absolutely. The North Koreans have done more to isolate themselves than any externally imposed sanctions could do. And what's really interesting to me on this point is that I think increasingly that Kim Jong-un may have used his COVID response in order to recover some of the losses that he faced after Hanoi. And so what's interesting to me is the pandemic response really as an instrument for consolidating power and control in North Korea through the imposition of this quarantine and through re-centralization of power in North Korea.
Right. And meanwhile, South Korean President Moon Jae-in said at a press conference in Australia that the US, South and North Korea, and China have agreed in principle to declare a formal end to the Korean War. Ambassador, does this mean we're closer to officially ending the Korean War?
I don't think so. I think there may be less here than meets the eye. Sure, President Moon is strongly committed to this end of war declaration. He believes that it would facilitate engagement and lead to progress on the nuclear issue. But the Biden administration is skeptical. I think the Biden team would be prepared to accept an end of war declaration, but as part of a package that also advances the nuclear issue. I think the Biden team strongly doubts that a standalone declaration would have a positive effect and would bring North Korea to the table.
Mr. Snyder, what's your take on what Moon Jae-in is trying to achieve?
Well, I agree with Ambassador Einhorn. I think that this is a case where the headline wasn't really supported by the facts of the article. And if you really look at what President Moon said, he basically stated the facts, but I think the headline conveyed maybe the atmosphere surrounding President Moon's hopes. Rather than the actual reality of the circumstances around the end of war declaration.
Mm-hmm. And then there was a news report coming out of South Korea. Former top South Korean diplomat on North Korea, Lee Do-hoon, told foreign journalists in Seoul, he said the end of a war declaration should not come without the denuclearization. Mr. Snyder, he was working for President Moon Jae-in, and he was top negotiator towards the North Korea. What is he saying here?
Well, I think it's pretty clear. He's saying that end of war needs to be accompanied by a denuclearization process, very similar to what Ambassador Einhorn just stated as the U.S. preference in terms of this approach. And essentially what this suggests is that there are a lot of doubts, even by a former South Korean negotiator, about the idea that the symbolic value of an end of war declaration is necessarily going to generate tangible benefits. Rather, the right approach is to lay the groundwork in terms of connecting the priorities of both North Korea and the United States into a package, perhaps around this end of war declaration, but also around the denuclearization issue, that can enable both sides to move forward in a concerted fashion to address their mutual concerns.
Mm-hmm. Ambassador, can the end of war declaration come as a process rather than as an end state?
Yes. If there is to be an end of war declaration, I agree with Scott's analysis. I think it would be most helpfully part of a package that also involves the nuclear issue. But it's just the first step. Ultimately, it would lead to a peace regime on the peninsula, a peace treaty among relevant parties, and so forth. But this is a long process. And I think the making peace, a permanent peace on the peninsula, really must go hand in hand with steps toward denuclearization. And after all, this was an approach that was embodied in the Singapore joint statement between President Trump and Kim Jong-un when they talked about these parallel processes taking place. But it's a long-term process, and I can't imagine a peace treaty in the absence of denuclearization.
So, Ambassador, just to make sure, the end of war declaration should come with denuclearization rather than end of war declaration leading to North Korea's denuclearization. Is that right?
I think the Biden administration is prepared to go along with the end of war declaration as a very early step, but it needs to be accompanied by some progress on the nuclear issue, not complete denuclearization, but some modest steps to begin the process.
All right. And Mr. Snyder, your last thought?
Well, I agree with that. I would also say that another pathway that one can imagine on the end of war issue would be to work on tangible tension reduction between the two Koreas, building on the comprehensive military agreement that was signed in 2018. And one thing about that pathway is that it prioritizes conventional over nuclear, but in the end, you can't have a sustainable peace without also dealing with the nuclear component. So if you're looking for a softer way designed to build confidence on the North Korean side and on the US and South Korean side, that is another plausible pathway that one might consider.
Mm-hmm. All right. Ambassador, do you have anything to add to this?
No, I agree that progress in inter-Korean relations would be quite helpful. The impediment, though, to progress in inter-Korean relations is the nuclear issue. There are sanctions in place that inhibit that North-South cooperation, and those sanctions are not going to be reduced until there's progress in the nuclear issue. So, all roads, seem to lead back to the nuclear problem. I believe that if some progress can be made on the nuclear issue, then the United States should relax some of the sanctions on that inhibit inter-Korean relations to permit some of those projects to go forward. I think that would be a strong confidence-building measure.
This week, the United States named North Korea as a state sponsor of terrorism, keeping North Korea on the list for 5 years since 2017. And for the 17th straight year, the UN General Assembly has adopted a resolution on North Korea's human rights situation, condemning the systematic and gross human rights violations by the regime. Ambassador Einhorn and Mr. Snyder, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
And that does it for this week's Washington Talk from Voice of America. Please join us again next week for more analysis.